Still letting a few more people come in. People are joining us right now. I want to give that just a few minutes for everyone to come on in and join us. I have a note here from German. He's having difficulties with camera and speakers. So German, I hope that you can hear us. And if you get your camera and speaker figured out, just feel free to join the conversation. I see we have Tim Abbott. Tim, feel free to introduce yourself if you can unmute there. And also John Shepard. John is joining us as well. Hi, John. How are you, sir?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Yeah. How are things in Florida for you?
Well, kind of tenuous, you know, trying to figure out what's going to happen with this virus next. Hopefully they don't shut us down again.
Yeah. I think we'll talk about that in a few minutes after we get started. I've been on a lot of conversations lately where, you know, COVID isn't high topic, right? So important stuff. That's difficult situation, tough things to get used to, and a changing environment for all of us, business and personally. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by doing a couple of introductions and letting you know that we are recording today's program, and it is our hope that we can post this on NTCA's YouTube channel so people can share in this information, just join our discussion and realize that if they weren't able to join us today, what they might have missed out on. And I want to get started by introducing, first of all, my counterparts on NTCA staff, Randy Fleming. Randy, why don't you say hi and introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, Randy Fleming, kind of new with the NTCA, I guess new for only a little over a year into it, but in the tile business, long time, started in '79, still actually just got back from a job this morning already. So been there, done that, got some scars to show for it.
And you're not in Florida?
And I'm not in Florida, Central California.
All right, coast to coast today. And my partner, Rob Roderick. Hi, Rob.
Hey guys, I think I've met most of you. If I haven't, my name's Rob Roderick. I'm in the center of the country, Springfield, Missouri, but they let me come down to Florida the last 2 years, and that's been probably some of the favorite trips I've made, going down there. Usually in February, it's wonderful. I leave here and there's ice on the truck, and I get there and it's 80 degrees. So anyway, I told Jim, you need someone to go to Florida in February, I'm your man. Send me there. So, but anyway, I'm glad you guys all are spending time here. And if I haven't met you, I'm glad to meet you.
We fight over those trips to Florida, not just because of seeing all you guys, but because of the weather. And last but not least, I want to introduce our Region 4. Florida is NTCA's Region 4. We have 12 regions in the NTCA. And that encompasses the entire state of Florida. And Mike Weaver is the co-owner of Trendsetter Tile and Stone. He'll tell you a little bit more about himself, but he's been in the tile industry for 24 years or more, and has had his own business, Trendsetter Tile, since the 2000s, and is a terrific guy. If you haven't yet met Mike Weaver, you're in for a treat when you meet him and get to know him. He is just fantastic. So Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, well, thanks, Mark. And yeah, I've been with Trendsetter since 2007, and doing a lot of work, sometimes all the way from Fort Lauderdale to Jupiter. And we specialize in doing bathrooms. And today, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I've been seeing with failures that we have sometimes in Florida. And there's a type of installation that a lot of guys do down here, and it's referred to as a false mud set. But you may know it as a marble set or a mud set or a mortar set. And it's a method that's not recognized by the TCNA or ANSI. And I'm bringing up this topic not to convince you not to use this method, but rather to demonstrate why it's not in the handbook and give you things to think about when this method is in consideration for one of your projects. So to get you familiar with this installation, how it's done, usually the installer will apply a scratch coat of thin set, a very thin layer. Maybe he'll use a V-notch trowel or something like that and scratch the concrete floor or whatever the substrate is, whether that's on Durock on top of plywood or whatever the substrate is. And then he'll install mortar mix to make a mortar bed directly on top of that, and then apply another scratch coat to the back of the tile or marble, whatever type of tile that they're going to put down, and effectively making a sandwich of these layers. So you got your scratch coat, your mortar bed, scratch coat on the back of the tile, and then you embed that into the mortar with usually an installer will use a rubber mallet. And the thickness of this bed can be anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1 1/4 inch, depending on how out of tolerance the subfloor is in relation to flatness. Let's see, and keep in mind that this installation is all done while all the layers are still wet. This method became prominent in the 90s, probably in the early 90s, when a lot of tile was still 12 by 12 at a maximum, and then it started increasing in size to 16 by 16, 18 by 18. And it was used by a lot of guys to correct the floor as you go. And guys were installing a lot of tiles where they were butted together and there was no grout joint. They needed it to be really flat. So this was easy type of method to, correct the floor as you go and eliminate wide grout joints and use a larger tile. So there's a couple of problems with this type of installation, and let me just outline that. It's used either to level the substrate, or to create a slope with the tile as you go, or to match the height of an existing floor. Those are the main reasons why someone would use it. And the first problem with it is the mud itself. Most of the time, it's a stucco mortar mix. And stucco mortar mix has a maximum depth of 1/2 of an inch when it's installed for its intended use. And flooring contractors often exceed this. They also reduce the bed to as little as 1/4 of an inch thick when they're faced with a crown in the floor. TCNA method 112 shows that a bonded mortar bed without reinforcing must be a minimum of 3/4 of an inch. So stucco mortar mix already fails to meet that criteria because it's not meant to be installed that thick. The mortar bed that follows the initial bond coat on the substrate is usually applied with a spade trowel and chopped or piled to make a mud bed, and then they compress it with a mallet. And the problems with this is that there could be voids in the cured mud bed, which would reduce the impact resistance and can also retain moisture. And depending on the moisture's pH, it may deteriorate the mud bed, reducing its life expectancy. This method can have a high compressive strength, but it has an extremely low shear strength. The method can be problematic over wood substrates, even when installed over cement backer board due to its lack of reinforcement and insufficient bond coat. Deflection is often the cause leading to the failure when grout joints are cracked or the tiles debond. Another problem with this installation is the weight of the installation. It can have negative effects. This method, when used in a condominium or over a wood substrate, can increase the weight in excess of 15 pounds per square foot. And something like a self-leveler would make the floor 11 pounds per square foot. And in a condominium that's 2,000 square feet, that's basically adding 8,000 square feet to the footprint of the entire job. That's like parking your truck in the middle of the room. Not to mention that it's also so much more material that you have to bring up to the job site and you have to install. So these mud beds without a waterproofing membrane are also notorious for efflorescence. Mortar mix is not as refined as thin set mortars, and mortar mix often contains minerals that migrate to the face of the tile. And these soluble salts can take years to deplete, if ever. And on a balcony and driveway, it probably is forever. And a waterproofing cannot be placed below, or I'm sorry, while waterproofing can be placed below the initial bond coat, it cannot be placed above that mortar mix. So essentially you wouldn't be stopping water from getting to the mortar. You'd only be stopping it from getting to the substrate. And that's why all that water that can collect in that mortar mix can then transfer efflorescence to the top. Another thing to think about is how wet thin-set mortar applied to the back of the tile is placed into wet mortar mix. When you embed the tile into the mortar mix, you force the aggregate to the bottom of the mix, and this forces the water to the top. And now either through your action of embedding the tile or as moisture vapor rises during the curing process, you've introduced water to the thin-set scratch coat on the bottom of the tile. And this is a bond breaker scenario, as well as a weakening of the thin-set mortar that you just applied to the tile, compromising an already questionable bond coat. By installing this method, you're also eliminating many of the membrane options that could enhance your installation or that would have met any requirement that you were to comply with. For instance, an uncoupling membrane. It cannot be used with this method. While uncoupling could be used over a cured mortar bed, it cannot be used below it or installed on top of a wet mortar bed. It must be applied with thin-set mortar beneath it and the tile installed with the appropriate notch trowel above it. Another membrane that cannot be used with this method is sound control or crack isolation membranes. The acoustical properties of the membranes are based on the thin-set method. When you install a mortar bed on top of the membrane, you have increased the distance from the tile covering to the membrane. When the membrane is installed correctly with the thin-set mortar at a thickness of approximately 3/16 to 1/4 inch, sound from the top of the tile travels to the membrane, which is dispersed laterally across the membrane. And this is how you get a reduction in sound, both above the installation and below it. But however, when there's a stucco mortar bed that separates the thin-set mortar from direct contact with the membrane, a hollow sound is produced upon impact on the tile covering. The sound is essentially reflected back towards the source. And while the floor has not debonded, you would still be hard pressed to convince a homeowner or a builder that the hollow sound in the floor is not a failure. So I understand that many of you have had successful installations in this manner, and they can work. They're just unpredictable because any one of those scenarios could affect this installation months or years after the installation. So in going forward, you know, only you can determine what's the best installation method for anything that you do in your business. So you just have to calculate the risk of using this type of installation in your business. You know, is it worth it to you to do something that is not in the handbook, because it could certainly come back to bite you if you do have a failure, and then you cannot point to you know, something that substantiates why you did that type of method. So that's why it's important to do things with the standards and guidelines as often as possible. So I just wanted to, you know, bring that to light so everybody understands that that type of method, which goes on a lot in Florida and some other places around the country, is not an approved method, and you may want to think twice before utilizing it. A self-leveler would certainly be a better option to correct the floor ahead of time and then install whatever membrane you need, whether that's waterproofing or you know, any other kind of crack isolation membrane, uncoupling, anything like that, and then use the thin-set method with the appropriate size trowel. Doing it the other way is a risk. So I just want to make you guys aware of that. So that's what I had to say about that. So thank you.
That is terrific information, Mike. And that was a lot of information about using the right methods, the right materials, selecting the right membrane and placing the membrane at the right location in the system. And I know that you and I have talked, and I can speak, I think, a little bit for Rob and Randy. we get this question in different areas of the country. Florida is certainly one of them, where you have a lot of condos and high-rise condos that have sound control membranes and have all of these issues. Has anybody on our panel here, anybody that's joined us, have you experienced success or failure, or do you have questions or concerns about what Mike has talked about? I know that, I just want to say again, Mike, as our director there, has seen some significant use of what he's just described, and spot bonding, I'll add. We want to discuss that to see if we can improve that situation and information.
You know,
I've never heard of that technique before, ever. Like in Panama City, I've never seen that used here. Thankfully, I wouldn't want to see it used. That sounds too good.
Yeah, you know, it may be more of a South Florida issue. You know, down here, we tend to have a lot of methods that kind of come from around the country and from around the world, and then they wind up here. You know, it's just it's the way that I find Florida to be in the construction industry, is people take some good habits and bad habits with them, and then it winds up being centered here. And I know that, you know, it was one of the ways that I learned to install tiles back in the 90s. That was one of the things in the toolkit, was this is an acceptable way to install marble. If you had marble that was 24 by 24, it's not uncommon to do it this way, because the floors, the substrates are so bad that they need correction. And back in the 90s, you know, I started in 96. And so at that time, when I was learning the trade, self-levelers, though they were around and everything like that, there wasn't a lot of training for them, and they were very expensive at that time. So this was considered a cost-efficient way of correcting a floor as you went. And there are successful installations done like this. So I can't come out and say that they're all outright failures. That is not the way it is. I mean, even we know that spot bonding is basically a failure waiting to happen, but there are some spot bonding installations that, for whatever reason, they managed to hang on, and nobody knows it was a failure, and nobody knows it was spot bonding until it's time to remodel it. That doesn't make it right, you know. And so this method is similar to that. It may have a higher success rate than something like spot bonding, but it's not a great option. So that's why I bring it to light. And I do speak with a lot of contractors around the country, and they have the same view towards it. They never heard of it, or they wouldn't consider doing it and stuff like that. And that's great, you know, but down here we do see it a little more often than we'd like. So that's why we're bringing this up today.
Yeah, I'm going to say this, Mike, and the rest of the people on the call. This is Harold Yarborough with D&D Tile Distributors, and we sell truckloads of mortar mix. We don't want to, because it's not a proper method, but if we don't, then all of our competitors will. It's insane. And we teach it, you know, all of the NTCA events. It's discussed because it's prevalent in South Florida, because a lot of it has to do with what a lot of guys call the old marble method, and they just, you know, put mortar down, and mortar is good, but a lot of these guys are mixing it soft and loose and watery and not bonding it properly. And all these large formats. I mean, today, you know, 24 by 24 is a small unit today in any of these residential installations. With all the high rises and all of the homes being done, remodeled, we don't even show 24 by 24s in our showrooms anymore, hardly at all. If it is, it's not usually stocked. We're doing 24 by 48s, 48 by 48s, 30 by 30, 36 by 36, and so on. It's crazy. It's in the last 5 years, it's just gone insane. I mean, I know Mike is putting large formats on the bathroom walls. When's the last time you put a 6x12 on a wall, Mike? You know, it's
Yeah,
just
it's not
doesn't
as
happen.
often.
Yeah,
Well,
it's a cheap bathroom.
we still use small format tiles. I mean, in fact, like I don't understand how a tile setter can get a big format tile like that done correctly without hollow spots. Like I don't trust it. I don't see how a 2 foot by 2 foot tile, that's about the limit that I would sell in my store. I don't install. I own a flooring store and we sell it. So like if I see, or a customer comes in looking for a 3x3 or 4x4, I usually tell them that's not going to work out. And I don't care if I lose the sale, because I just don't really see a tile setter being able to do that correctly, at least in Panama City, Florida. Maybe in other areas where they've got a bigger talent pool, but like all I can see in my mind is tile failure with hollow spots and not getting the coverage that they need and all that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, the installer certainly has to have a higher level of training, and that's why they have like the ACT certification, you know, for the thin gauge porcelain and everything like that requires an installer that has gone through the training, has the confidence and the right equipment to install it properly. They can get very good coverage out of it. But the average tile guy that maybe only deals with you know, 24 by 24 and smaller, well, potentially he could have trouble if he's not familiar with preparing a substrate adequately. You know, and then that's like the whole thing with the false mud set, is it they really were doing it to establish a greater substrate, and it's the wrong way of going about it, you know. But if you have an installer that knows how to make sure that the walls are plumb and flat and everything is true, well, you can have a very successful installation in a capable installer's hands, even if he's not necessarily familiar with the larger size, because the substrate is primed and ready to receive a large tile. Problems with large tile usually happen when something is wrong with the substrate and the person did not correct for it ahead of time. That's exactly why spot bonding became a problem, is some individuals thought they were actually fixing the wall as they went by spot bonding the tile. So, you know, it does take a little bit more knowledge on the installer's part, but the large tile is perfectly doable, and you can get good coverage with it.
Yeah, we only sell tile also, we don't install, but I came from a background, my dad was a tile contractor for many years, and I was a tile contractor for many years, and then he sucked me into distribution, and and it's tough. But basically what it is properly prepped. The large format's done every day, and there's very good installations. So I wouldn't be afraid of it at all. A large notch trowel, proper mortar bed, heavy tile mortar, thin set mortar, and we're doing it every day, and some very good installers are doing it and know the methods, because again, NTCA and what we try to teach on with all the suppliers, Latticrete Custom Building Products, Mapei, Southern Grout Mortars, and many others are going around doing a much better job today teaching, if they get the ability to do that. But in our market, and Mike can attest to this, probably about 75% of the installers are from another country. And they just learn that method, and they just spot bond or, you know, thick mortar. And it's just, you know, Ivan Chino was on the call earlier. He was driving, and he's one of our very good ACT CTI installers and out there, and he's teaching these guys that work for him, and he's a big advocate of ANSI and TCNA specifications. So it's getting to all of them. I mean, there's thousands of guys in South Florida, and they do spread around the country, and they'll end up taking some of these methods with them. I was just talking to a guy recently from Boston, and he wants to move back to South Florida. And we chatted a little bit. I said, "You didn't take those bad methods up there, did you?" And he laughed. He goes, "No, they don't understand that up here." So it's something we battle always to stay with industry standards. And I know Mike does all he can to teach the guys when he hears stuff and any of the distribution points that he's in. So we just got to keep the message up and keep the failures down, because it really hurts our industry long term.
I just want to jump in here and echo a couple of things I heard Harold say, that proper substrate prep, which includes substrate flatness, begins there. Proper mortar selection, mortar mixing, follow the manufacturer's instructions, learning how to select the mortar correctly, and then a few other things like surface saturated dry, making sure the substrate isn't too dry, all of these things, and then trowel selection and usage. There's a lot of trowels out there that we're finding in some of our educational programs, and some of them in Florida, that installers are, you know, maybe setting everything with a 1/2 by 1/2 square notch. While that's a classic great trowel, there might be new ones of different design and different shape, different size, that could be better to collapse those ridges, get the right mortar applied. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you to think for just a minute. And I want to bring in German and Tim, who don't have audio. They have some questions over in the chat screen. Let's see. Tim did say that there are warranted systems with thick beds over membranes, but it needs to be certain products, the products that he works with, and that they can't approve them over membranes. He does say they have seen a huge issue with S-type mortars and M-type mortars, I think, Mike, in the system that you were describing there. Yeah. There's a couple of other questions here from Tim and German, but I'm going to hold on to those for just a few minutes and let this discussion continue.
Hey, up in South Dakota, we don't see that method that you were talking about, Mike, very often, but we lost a condo job in here been a few years back, and I went and looked and see how somebody from out of state could come to South Dakota and do a job cheaper than us for being here. Yeah. And it was a 2 foot by 2 foot marble job, or limestone actually job. And they were setting it with about an 1/8 inch joint. It looked pretty good and flat, but they were using a fat mud, and they were beating them in one tile at a time. And I couldn't see how that was going to work either with their thin, all they were doing, they were just scratching the back of the tile with a flat trowel. They weren't even putting any notch on it. But you know what? We haven't been back up to that unit with any complaints either. And I know the contractor that did it, and they haven't complained anything about that falling apart. But that was a different installation that I've never seen, and we never took it on. I didn't trust it. We use mostly self-level and stuff. But even up here, it has spread that, you know, that the only one I've seen, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been more of that same installation done.
Yeah, I don't know where it originated from. You know, I don't know if it's some old technique from way back when, you know, maybe from somewhere in Europe, or if installers from Central America and South America do it there all the time and brought it this way. But installers in Florida, a lot of them have figured out a way to incorporate that into their installations. And I've had many jobs where I've gone to bid on a job and explained the installation process to the customer. And then the customer said to me, "Oh, well, you know, so-and-so said that this is the way that they're going to do it, like this." And they'll identify to me that it's a false mud set. And, you know, or that's what I identify it as. And I'm like, okay, well, you know, I outline what all the problems or potential problems there are with that. I mean, sometimes, you know, a slab in Florida can be so bad. It can, you know, from one corner of the house to the other corner of the house, you're talking about an inch of difference in a long span of a house. It could be that different. And what these guys are doing is trying to level the floor as they go. So they can wind up having an inch or more of this mortar easily by the time they get across a room or across the other side of the house. And, you know, the thicker that mortar bed gets, it's only going to get weaker. And the installer will tend to get fatigued as he's going across the house, because it is a lot more labor. You're going to be mixing buckets and buckets and buckets of mortar and placing it, and it's time to mix another one. And if the mixer happens to make that mix, you know, on the wet side, you're going to get more shrinking and everything with the mortar. So it's just, you know, when it gets that thick too, you know, people are talking about having to, you know, cut their door jambs up, and you know, almost 2 inches high in some areas if you got a thick marble on top of that thick bed. And that's really ridiculous, when what we're looking to do is to make the substrate flat, not necessarily level out an entire slab, you know. So a self-leveler works excellent. And you know, it's only been in the last you know, 5 to 10 years that I've seen some installers around here start to catch on that the self-levelers are more affordable than they used to be. And also, you don't have the problems with the batch going off too fast. You know, you would, you know, 15 years ago, you could make some self-leveler up and you mixed it fast, and you better run to where you got to get that and put it down on the floor really fast. It'll lock up in the bucket. And that's what turned a lot of guys off to self-levelers early on. And so this method was an inexpensive way to do a job that, you know, there is a better way.
Tim, would you have something to chime in on that conversation? Is your microphone working?
Yeah, I had to go to my cell phone instead of my desktop, but
You look great, Tim.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we have a huge issue with that type of application, especially in South Florida. People are using the S-type mortars, the stucco mix, on top of the membrane. There's a huge amount of shrinkage that occurs with those products. If you call the manufacturer of those products, they're going to tell you that it's not even recommended for flooring applications. So, and then it also acts as, with regards to the sound control, it acts as a tuning fork, and your higher frequencies, they carry for a much longer time. So you're going to have diminished sound control with the membranes. This has been going on a long time. We had to come up with a solution. So we created a product to go over top of membranes that aren't going to have the shrinkage and that isn't going to diminish your sound control efforts and things like that. The only other company I know of that has one is Latacrete, that would do the same type thing. But if someone calls us, we're going to tell them, our technical service group and everything else, we're going to tell them self-leveling is definitely the best route to go.
Tim, tell everybody who you're with, Tim.
Okay, I'm the CEO of ProFlex. We're a Florida-based company, and we manufacture grouts, thin sets, and everything else, and then sound control membranes and waterproofing and all those things. Florida is our home base. That's where we started, and we do very well in Florida, and we're kind of like the Kleenex of the industry when it comes to sound control. But yeah, we have a lot of problems with the thick bed applications over the membranes.
Yeah. Okay. It's terrific to have you here and your expertise and your company's expertise. And we'll get back to you and we'll let people ask you questions. I just want to be the voice for German. And German kind of echoed some things that John had said a few minutes ago. And he says, unfortunately, many installers have their ways and have been using this method for years, and they refuse to change that method. So that's what you were talking about. That's what people learn and use and know. And he says, German says, he's had situations where people just refuse to listen because they feel that perhaps in his case, he's younger than they might be. And hey, what does that young guy know? But a lot of times that young guy has gotten the knowledge and he's way above that person who's been in the industry for maybe even longer than Randy, if that's possible. I don't know. And one of the things that German agrees with, it's very common in the Miami area, and it's often done to stretch materials and get lower costs and a quicker turnaround. And Mike, I think you agree with that too, that it's used as a money saver.
Oh yeah, there's a big cost savings to doing that way. I mean, there's a price to pay later on if there's a problem, you know. But yeah, mortar mix is fairly inexpensive. I mean, really, the trade-off in labor, it never made any kind of sense to me. I mean, it's just the kind of work you have to put into it to do it is. It's mix upon mix and everything like that. And there's so many materials to move, especially if you're upstairs or you have to bring it up an elevator or anything like that. You know, it's going to take longer overall. You know, like when if I do a job and I'm using a self leveler, for me to self level 1,000 feet is nothing. It's a morning. It's easy. You know, as fast as you mix the material up, the material is going down. Excuse me, it's going to cure overnight and everything like that. I mean, it's walkable maybe in 4 or 5 hours. You know, so the trade-off for how much it saves you in labor is a great benefit I've thought of for a long time. But some guys still think that they're saving money by buying a more inexpensive material and working harder, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and it really is about teaching them, and where this method did come from is the stone industry, because I did an apprenticeship with an old Italian instructor that he was Italian, and he taught us that method with setting marble. And I think that's a stone method that, you know, all the stonemasons I know, that's just the way they set stone, you know, flagstone and so forth. You just set it in fat mud or mortar, you know, wet mortar, and they just roll with it that way. And it's taken on that method, I think, throughout South America, where a lot of our installers in South Florida come from, and even in Europe, and so they're applying it to the tile methods. And as we know, the TCNA does not follow that method because there's proper products, and it's just really just trying to keep sending the message out, and I know we do in our company. So that's my experience, is that it was taught by me, an old Italian instructor, that he said, this is the way you do it.
Thank you, Harold. And I can say that Harold and D&B are terrific supporters of education and the tile industry and certification as well. Thank you. We're thrilled to have you. Randy.
Yeah, so I must have had the same Italian guys that taught me as well, old Italian guys, and they set stone, but they did it with deck mud. And so that would be right in harmony with ANSI 108.1A. You can do that method with a deck mud, keeping, now like Mike said, you got to have the 3/4 inch minimum deck mud, and a bonded system. So that's how we would do it. Usually fresh set with dry, dust it with pure, sprinkle it with water, beat in the stone, And that was the method that I learned for, you know, thick setting stone, but it was deck mud. It was not fat mud.
And
Yeah.
that method, the wet set method,
Correct.
the mud is compacted before you're dusting it first. It's not compacted along with the tile.
And it's not going over a membrane.
Correct.
Correct.
And that's a more skilled method, you know, that requires an installer that knows specifically how to do that.
Yep. Tim, we can come back to this part of the conversation, but I have something that came to my mind with Tim.
Uh-oh.
Well, and I think with all of you that work in high rises, and John, I think if I remember correctly, we may have discussed this before too, high rises and sound control membranes and some of the complexities with them. And I'm particularly curious about a product like cork. Where does cork fit into today's sound control environment?
We don't run into it a whole lot anymore, ever, unless they're doing a wood floor application. But cork hasn't been, at least in Florida, I haven't seen a whole lot of it. I'm sure it still goes on occasionally, but I think most cork is sourced out of Portugal, and I think there's been some issues with quality, and not all cork is created equal. So we haven't really run into it a whole lot. We do use a little bit of cork in a couple of our membranes, our rubber membranes, but we did that not for the sound control, but more for the bond strengths of thin sets and adhesives. We found that when you're dealing with solid rubber, you lose a ton of bond strength. And by adding that little bit of cork, we were able to increase the bond strength by over 5 times that of a solid rubber. So we still use some of it, but it's granules that are mixed into our rubber, and it's for bond strength.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah, back in the 80s, 90s, 2000, we sold a ton of cork, but I probably haven't sold any cork in 5 years. It's
The
not
problem I see, there'll be cork sometimes is required in some condominiums that have a board of directors that only know one way, you know, so they, you know, they know in their past condominium that they used cork, and oh, cork is what you use. And so some condominiums are not updated on what would be better. And so sometimes they're the ones that are requiring that type of thing. And most of the time, most cities don't perform an inspection for the sound control. An inspection for sound control is done by someone in the condominium, you know, a board member or a maintenance person or something like that. So that's why still from time to time, you'll go to a condominium, they say, well, we require cork. And I know that most of the time what they'll require is 1/4-inch cork. And the only, I think it's ANSI, the only one that says anything about cork is for 1/2-inch cork. You know, so there is something on the book still for 1/2-inch cork, but not for the 1/4-inch, which some of these condominiums are specifying. So it's really an education thing for some of these people that run the condominiums.
Yeah, and the sound, I'm sorry, the sound control for the cork products, it was done on a 1/2-inch cork, and they use a very thick notch trowel for urethane adhesives, which do very well for sound control. But when it's installed in the field, most people are using a mastic. So it's not going to get the results that they may have listed on their test. And again, not all cork is created equal. Some of that stuff's pretty brittle and isn't going to perform real well, especially with tile.
Tim, generally speaking, if substrate prep to make the substrate flat needs to be done, where would the sound control layer go? Would it generally go beneath or above the flattener?
We would prefer that they use a self-leveling underlayment, preferably ours. And then they would use our primer and then the membrane or the adhesive in the membrane to go on top. That wasn't happening, and that's why we had to develop a system that could go on top of our membrane. But it's a more detailed installation, and it's still not your $4 a bag mud. It's you know, it's 3 times the cost of regular floor mud. But you have to do a scratch coat with an ANSI 11811 thin set on top of the membrane. Then you can do the hour thick bed, or Latacrete makes one, like I said, over top, and then back butter your tile and go on top of it like that. But it's more in-depth installation than just throwing down some floor mud and sticking a tile to it. Most floor muds aren't going to stick to anybody's membrane, not just ours, but anybody's.
Right. Thank you, Tim. And I also want to thank you and your company for being a sponsor and supporter of our NTCA programmings. You know, we can't do this without people like you. Thank you to help us get that education to everyone. And along with that, do you offer a system warranty? That's a pretty important thing. You mentioned your products used in concert with each other. Is there an additional warranty type benefit with that?
Yeah, we as with most manufacturers, they're going to want you to use their system. So, I mean, we will warrant products that aren't ours on top of our membranes, or some of our products on top of other people's membranes. But typically that's like a 5-year warranty. We go up to a lifetime warranty if you use our complete system, depending on what products you put together. And we're always available to work with the installation company or the contractors, that the building contractors or the architects, the condo boards. We'll come and do a presentation, explain to them that, you know, just the other thing with sound control is there are so many games that are played with sound control with the testing and everything. I sit on the ASTM E33, and we're trying to get that kind of standardized, but there's a lot of pushback. So if a condo has a build out that we don't have a product that's going to work, we'll let them know, look, I don't know how you're going to get to this number. But we will go and talk to the boards and things like that and tell them, you know, you're going to either have to use several products together to get to that number, or it's impossible to get to that number.
Okay, terrific. I want to just give a shout out here to Jim or Doug or Scott. If you have anything to jump in with, please feel free to come on in. Ivan, you as well. We see you're driving. Be safe there. But go ahead and jump in. Scott, do you have anything to add to this discussion? I know you do specifications and designs, and you're deeply involved with standards and whatnot.
Well, I am, but I'm learning from you guys. So I'm really here more to listen than to talk today. So thank you for the education.
Terrific. Scott, can you give us a little bit of a background who you are so everybody knows?
Sure. Yeah, I'm an architect with the International Masonry Institute, or the IMI. We are the association that provides the training and the apprenticeship and some of the certifications on behalf of the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers and the contractors. So what does masonry and brick have to do with tile? Well, the tile setting trade is an allied craft of the bricklaying trade. So in the areas where the tile setters are union, it's the bricklayers and allied craft workers is the union they belong to. So what I do is I'm kind of IMI's tile representative, so I give a lot of architectural presentations to architects, designers on the proper use of tile. So I'm always looking to expand my education on tile design and tile installation.
Yeah, thank you. And if any of you are on LinkedIn, search out some of Scott's posts. He does some incredible design work that's really super informative and just amazing to look at, and to help us understand how things like steam showers and any type of system should be built. It's amazing stuff, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. You work for me, by the way. I'm a BAC3 member, so.
Oh, great. Yes, I do work for you.
Okay.
I haven't sent him a check recently, but we'll get to it.
Yeah, he needs a check from you, Randy. I had a question for John Shepard, but I see John has stepped away. If he comes back into view, we'll get over to John. Mike, anything else that you'd like to bring up on this subject we've been talking about prep, product usage, standards?
No, I mean, we really touched on the false mud set, which was what I really wanted to get across to everybody today and stuff like that. And you know, even for Scott, Scott, was the false mud set something that you've seen was happening on any installations, or were you unfamiliar with it, or?
Totally unfamiliar. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, sometimes, an architect may specify something to be done, and an installer could very well use that method on your project, and it's one of those things where I know that some, I don't know if it's architects or designers, will specify that they either want CTEF installers or they want NTCA installers and stuff like that. And then, sometimes maybe in the notes, there would be something that says, false mud set is not an acceptable form of installation for this project, or some note like that puts it out right in the beginning as this is not going to work for this project, take it somewhere else type of thing, so that's why when you said you were an architect, I thought about that type of thing with you guys.
Andy.
Yeah, so for me, on the commercial projects that I work on, a lot depends on the inspector on site. Yeah, I've had inspectors that if it doesn't have that T crossed, it doesn't count as a T. And so if the method's spelled out and it's per this method, if they've spelled out the TCNA method from the handbook, how the material's supposed to be installed, and you have an inspector backing up, you usually have a pretty good way of holding to a spec. It's when the inspector is there just punching the clock, that's when whatever happens.
Terrific point. Scott, did you want to reply to that or move on?
Well, no, I mean, to Michael's point about putting language in the spec about what's an acceptable method and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I agree. In general, we do try to advocate specs that make sense. One of the examples is this qualified labor movement that the whole industry has really embraced. I think since 2012 was when the qualified labor language first appeared in the Tile Council handbook, and we see it in specs all the time now. I think it's just excellent. So, the point is that architects do listen. It may take a few years for spec language to catch on, but I think our industry is doing the right thing when we do try to put out their preferred way, and in this case, ways to avoid. So I'll definitely keep that in mind, Michael.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, we do have a huge amount of support from architects and specifiers for the qualified labor language across the board for the tile industry, and we see it more and more. I want to, Mike, if I can, I'd like to ask John Shepard. John, I think you and I have had some conversation about working on top of lightweight gypsum in high rises or second or third or fourth or fifth, sixth story structures. And if I remember correctly, we had talked about where the only reason for the new tile installation was maybe an update in the tile, but how that demo part left that gypsum in tatters and how to properly proceed with an installation.
Right. Yeah, I remember that conversation.
Remember that conversation? Are you still seeing installations like that?
Hardly ever. I mean, gypcrete is not that common around here, but when it is, we just use the recommended methods. And I don't remember off the top of my head what it is.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I want to ask Rob, maybe Rob can give us some advice on working with or on top of lightweight gypsum after demo. But before we go there, I want to ask Mike or maybe Harold if you are seeing lightweight gypsum installed and then having to work on top of that in high rises.
I'm not seeing it in high rises. Is I've seen it more often in like I guess they're like townhouses. On the second story of a townhouse, they might have a gypcrete type floor on the second floor up there, but it's not really what I'm specializing in is in bathrooms and stuff, and I haven't had to bid on a second floor in a townhouse in quite some time, so
okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was fairly, Mark, it was fairly common, you know, probably in the 90s and 2000s. A lot of builders, for some reason, and I don't really know why, they were putting it over a second story wood floor. And commonly construction in South Florida is slab on grade. And then if it's a two-story or larger, it's trusses with a wood floor, like common up north. And they were just the builders were pouring gypsum on those second floors and then having to tile over the bathrooms. And occasionally somebody would put tile in the bedrooms or the hallways. But typically there was a lot of failures that we saw and that I'm aware of. I'm not as active in the, you know, out in the field as I used to be, but it's not common anymore.
Okay, great. Randy, we'll get to you, but I would like to ask Rob if what it takes to, if you have gypsum, what's the best way to proceed with an installation on top of that?
Well, there's a variety of different types of gypcrete, you know, and they have names like Gypcrete 2000, Gypcrete, you know, there's a variety of them. And basically they're better now than they used to be. I don't think they're used as often, like Harold said, but anytime we install tile over them, we need to use a membrane. And there's a method for that in the handbook of how to do it. We could use a liquid applied membrane. We could use a sheet applied membrane. You can use an uncoupling mat. But where people run into problems are when they install directly to that gypcrete. Sometimes the manufacturer of the gypcrete will produce a primer that can be put on the gypcrete, and then you can get a warrantable installation with ceramic tile. But it's really questionable anytime you try to adhere directly to it. So you always need a membrane. There's a method in the handbook for the membrane. Some of the manufacturers of some liquid applied membranes at one point, and we would have to check what they currently did. At one point, they would allow you to dilute some of their waterproof membranes with water and mix them and apply that over a large surface of gypcrete, and that could be your barrier. But if you've done that and you remove tile from a gypcrete installation, generally the damage isn't as bad as if you directly adhere to it. If you directly adhere to it, you could completely tear out huge chunks in the floor and create all kinds of problems. And at that point, you're gonna have to build it back with, you know, cut out a section and maybe float it with mud and then go over the whole thing with a sheet membrane or an uncoupling mat, or maybe build it up with plywood and concrete board. So I'd probably say the biggest issues I've seen with it is directly adhering to the gypcrete And then when you take tiles up, what basically you have is just some salts or white on the bottom of the thin set. It just doesn't adhere to the gypcrete unless it has either that membrane on it or the manufacturer's sealer that needs to be put on it.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, or a primer, right? Randy, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, I have my a job coming up in a couple weeks in downtown San Francisco, gypcrete floor of right in their new Transbay terminal. It's a gypcrete floor. So I just checked the job about a week ago, and but yeah, there is a method to, if you prime it right and do those things. But you know, certain instances we have had those out here in the West Coast. Several.
And I think there's some type of acoustical value to it, because where it seems to be specified as in places where sound reduction is important, like second floor apartment housing or condominiums or on the second floor. I don't know if there is any. I kind of thought that maybe other people know about the reasons it's specified. I know it's probably cheaper and gives them a good alternative, but like Harold said, I don't think that they use it as often now as they did back in the 90s and 2000s early.
Okay. Yeah, John, I just wanted to bring that up. I know you and I had some sort of discussion about that. What sort of issues, if any, or questions do you have for your Panama City area?
I really don't. I just wanted to get on the call and like listen to what everybody else was saying, because I've never been on one before, and just see what kind of information was passed out. But yeah, the gypcrete, to my knowledge, is used because of sound control properties.
Okay.
I know it sucks when you get on top of a floor that's like falling apart.
Literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
Yeah, typically though, typically I think that the gypcrete, they have to put, there's a product called Echosonic, I think it is, and they put that down first, and then they pour the gypcrete over top of it for the sound control. I don't think gypcrete by itself adds a whole lot with regards to sound.
Okay. Great. Okay, I want to shift gears just for a second, Mike. I told German that I'd be his voice here, and I mentioned to you that he did have another question. And this is a change in gears. We're still talking about floors and horizontal surfaces. But here is what I just have to find it here. Oh, German says, I have a question regarding a toilet on top of porcelain tile. I have heard from a few sources that you need to caulk the bottom of the toilet to prevent the porcelain tile from cracking from the weight of the toilet. Rob or Randy, would one of you like to address that particular question? If not, that's okay.
Okay, yeah, well, the caulking underneath the toilet shouldn't have anything to do with the tile itself breaking. You know, what's important to keep a tile from breaking is to make sure that it's been installed correctly over a correct substrate. And probably one of the biggest things is making sure you have the right amount of mortar coverage, and there's standards for what we should have depending upon the situation. If we're just in a residential dry location, our responsibility is to get 80% mortar coverage. And if we're in a wet or an exterior installation, or we're using natural stone, then it's higher, it's 95%. That's what our responsibility is. So as far as the tiles breaking, the sealant's not going to, you know, help in any way to prevent that, but making sure you do an installation over the proper substrate, you know, something that is recognized by the industry and warranted by a manufacturer, making sure that you use the proper technique when you're spreading mortar and the proper types of mortar and getting those coverage amounts that I just mentioned. That's what's going to keep you from having tiles that crack.
Great answer, Rob. It's all about support of the tile from beneath and getting a flat substrate for that tile to sit on. The flat tile surface will conform to the flat substrate, might be a better way to put it. I might go out on a little bit of a limb here and say that it is probably not a best practice to put caulk or sealant around the toilet where it meets the tile surface. Personally, I don't see any need for that. Do
Well,
any
why
of you?
wouldn't you do it? I mean, because wouldn't the grout crack?
Well, I wouldn't grout it either.
Okay,
I would,
I gotcha.
yep, I would just have the toilet resting on the tile. No grout, no caulk, no sealant.
Sometimes I see it as a cleaning issue. So in hospitals and stuff like that, so stuff can get underneath the toilet. So they will caulk it. It'll be a requirement that it is caulked simply for cleaning issues. So stuff doesn't get underneath the toilet, then they can't get it out, that type of thing. But also back to Rob's point about flatness, typically if I've got a bathroom that's got toilets that the rings are already set, typically there's going to be a hump or something going on there. And so if people aren't getting the proper coverage under that cut tile by the toilet, they crank that toilet down. I'd figure one, the toilet's going to break from it being porcelain. But if that doesn't break, I figure if the tile's breaking, it's because of it not being properly supported.
German is chiming in. He agrees, and he says it's a common practice in Miami to caulk the bottom of the toilet. And if there's a leak in with the toilet, that caulk will stop the leak, and you won't know there's a leak, and you'll have bigger problems later, perhaps. So
That's a new one on me. I haven't heard that one before. Have you, Mike?
No, I mean, most of the time, usually depending, it depends kind of on the toilet itself too, because some of them have like a micro bevel down at the bottom, which might not look as nice unfilled. So, but he is right. It would, I have seen instances where the caulking around a toilet has had, like if someone used the stuff that turns the water blue, so that when the water's clean, it's blue. I have seen a blue down at the bottom of a toilet base where it discolored the caulking there, and that the water was escaping from they didn't have a good seal on around their flange with the wax ring and stuff. So I have seen that before, but most of the time, for an aesthetic point of view, you're going to wind up filling it in because the bottom of that porcelain toilet may be, a less than perfect angle around it. You don't get quite that seal.
yeah, interesting discussion. We're a little bit over time. I don't want to take up any more time than all of you have allotted for this discussion. I want to ask Mike if there's any other discussion he'd like to direct us in.
No, I think we did really good for today, and we took in a lot of information that we can help spread the word on. And if you weren't familiar before with a false mud set, now you could easily identify it or explain it to somebody else and stuff. So I think we did really good today.
I believe so too, Mike. And we will have more of these. And I would like to go around the loop here and give all of you one last chance to question or comment. And let's start with Dawn from South Dakota.
There we go. Trying the unmute button. No, I'm fine. The information Mike gave out was pretty good. I never knew what that was called, and I can see where that can be a problem. Our methods out here are pretty much standard with self levels, and we strive at Syverson's to train most of the people that work around here. We don't have as big of a market as you guys have in Florida and South Dakota, so we're able to have a little bit more personal contact with most of the setters around this area. And we, for the most part, between us and the NTCA and our manufacturers, our setting manufacturers, and say our underlayment manufacturers, do a pretty good job of getting the word out on specifications and how to do things properly. So good information that I've heard here today. It really does help that we can spread around. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Really glad you could join us today all the way from South Dakota. Um, Let me jump to Mr. Conwell from the beautiful sunny suburbs of Chicagoland.
No, I'm fine. I just appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the discussion, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I hope you can join us again in the future at our future roundtables. Great to have you. German, thank you for joining us. I really do appreciate you chiming in through the chat. Jim, we haven't heard from you, Jim. If you'd like to chime in, that would be terrific. Doug Griffiths, we can see you. If you can hear me and have something to chat about, feel free to jump in. Tim, I'm glad you were here. Can you give us a little wrap up on your company or anything you'd like to say?
No, I mean, again, you know, we do our best, and we really appreciate the NTCA, and the reason we support the organization as much as we do is we believe in what you guys are doing and teaching the correct methods, and we're seeing, like, I forget the gentleman's name, but in the last 5 years we also have seen things starting to go towards the direction of doing things the right way, which is important to us as manufacturers. And you know, we you know, I went to Israel a while back, and I saw tile floors that are still down after 2,000 years. And so I'm a big supporter of the entire industry, and I want to see that here, you know, for generations to come. So just appreciate everything you guys do.
Thank you, Tim. And it is amazing to see those installations. Mr. Shepherd, how about you, sir? Anything you'd like to add?
I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks for letting me listen.
Thanks for being here with us today. I do really appreciate it. Harold, thank you for your time and for being here and your wisdom and experience.
Well, I thank NTCA, and hopefully we can get more members on some of these chats. Great job, Michael. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rob?
I just want to thank everybody for showing up and spending this time with us, and I've really enjoyed it and appreciate you guys supporting us when we're on the road and all the things you guys do. So thank you.
Who gets to go to Florida next, you or me or Randy?
No, I'm gonna hang up and call Jim as soon as we get done with this. So I'll get it set up.
We love Florida. Randy.
Yeah, glad everybody could make it. Glad I could make it. Yeah, I like picking up bits and pieces from wherever across the country. Yeah, I've seen those methods done out here as well. They don't always work. So yeah, it's best to know the right way that things are to be done. And hopefully we get the word out.
Before I turn it over to you, Mike, I want to remind everybody here that if you're an NTCA member, your technical team of Rob and Randy and me and a few other people are here to help you, and hopefully with your installation before it goes in or even as it's being specified. That's what we're here for, and we'd love to help you out at any time. A terrific member benefit. And Mr. Weaver, thank you very much for everything you do for us, our industry, Florida, and being our eyes and ears and working hard to improve the installations there.
Well, thank you very much. The NTCA has done a lot for me, and I'm trying to help give back to the industry just like you guys are. So thanks for having me today.
We will be having more roundtables with Mike and with the rest of our 12 regions. We have more coming up in July. I think about 5 or 6 more. Please take a look at the NTCA website, and even if you're not in that region, feel free to register. In August, we will be starting a 2-week rotation throughout all of our regions. So this isn't the last one, it's just the first of many more to come. And we look forward to seeing all of you again. And with that, thank you, everybody. Glad to see you. Mike, great job. And see you
Thank you.
all next time.
All right.
Goodbye, everybody.